Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in. And before we begin, I want you to take just a second and hit that like button and subscribe. Those two little things make a big difference in how our message that is so important to our children, gets spread to new listeners. And that's critically important with today's topic. We're going to touch on something we have not talked about previously, and that is mental health. I have two guests today. I have Jay Goyal, who has a wide range of experiences working in public, private, and nonprofit sectors, I can say that, with a common goal of building and using technology to solve important problems. He's worked at the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, those mean people at the airport, microfinance in Honduras, Microsoft, and led an ed tech company, Actively Learn. Jay is now the CEO of Alongside, a startup with a mission to curb the youth mental health crisis. We're also joined by Dr. Elsa Friis, a licensed psychologist whose research has focused on leveraging technology to expand access to youth mental health treatments and preventative care in underreached populations in the U.S. and globally. Clinically, she has worked in both community and hospital-based settings and then transitioned to providing teletherapy to teens across the country during the pandemic. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University and previously worked as the director of clinical research at Little Otter, a pediatric telehealth company. Elsa is currently the head of mental health at Alongside. Jay, Elsa, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us. We're happy to join.
Good.
Yes.
We have a lot to talk about, but I want to start by talking mental health sort of in general. When a lot of people hear the term mental health, it conjures up some old stereotypical straitjackets, padded rooms, and lobotomies that really were the fare of like old horror movies. When we say mental health, what are we really talking about?
Absolutely. So I think of mental health in a few different ways. One, I really just think of it as that sense of, am I doing okay? And when the storms and the challenges of life comes, because they will come, things will happen. Do we feel like we are empowered enough to really cope and manage with those day-to-day stressors?
Thanks. That is really helpful. I know that in a lot of marginalized communities, and particularly in communities of color, in conversations that I've had with Black folks, Latino folks, and various Asian communities as well, they see mental illness as a weakness. And there are a lot of reasons for that, I know, especially in the Black community, given our history in this country. But these beliefs across marginalized cultures are entrenched in their culture. Now, personally, I have someone who is near and dear to my heart, highly intelligent, in their early 20s, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and family members simply said, we're just going to pray that devil away. That doesn't work. So how do we get people to understand that mental health is a health issue, just like high blood pressure and diabetes?
Absolutely. So this is something I love talking with kids and parents about. And so if we're thinking of our brain is an organ in our body, just like our heart, just like our lungs. And so our brain has a really, really important purpose. Just like our heart beats and we are, pumping our blood, keeping us alive, our brain is really wired to help us figure out, how do I stay safe? How do I react when hardship comes? And so it's really about, how do we understand when our brain is not actually being helpful for us and doing its job and protecting us? And when is our brain doing an amazing job? Because there's also many times when we can see also through this lens of what we might label from a very white upper middle class perspective as what is poor mental health is actually incredibly, incredibly adaptive for specific individuals with different lived experiences or within specific communities. And I think one kind of easy example of that is this idea of a concept called dissociation. And so dissociation is simply when our brain kind of shuts off and we almost feel like we're removed from the situation. And so if you are experiencing something like childhood trauma or abuse, that is actually an incredibly adaptive mechanism that your brain is there, your body is working to help protect you and provide safety. And yet sometimes, occasionally, those helpful and adaptive responses don't serve us well long-term, right? And so if that starts happening and I'm a student sitting in school and I'm having difficulty paying attention, that might put a kid at risk for having falling behind academically. And so really it's about embracing how our body's protecting and embracing when and recognizing when it's not as helpful.
Wow, that is hugely helpful to me. And as you were talking, I started thinking about the children that I served as a classroom teacher and how many of them had a variety of trauma that they dealt with. And we certainly didn't have any resources in our school to assist them with that. But that is the one place where we should be able to reach almost every single child. We also should have some knowledge about recognizing mental health concerns. I know I got nothing in teacher school about recognizing mental health concerns in our students. So I want to talk about our kids because really everything on my show is really about the children. And we're going to zero in on adolescents because you shared with me that we have a teen mental health crisis. So can you explain to our listeners what that is? And especially for our teachers and other educators, how is that showing up in school?
Absolutely. So, one benefit of the pandemic is it's actually started to put a spotlight on teen mental health. So the Surgeon General came out with an announcement around the teen mental health crisis. It's a great report. I recommend everyone looking at that as well. But really, this is something that has been going on for a while. So in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, we're seeing increases in anxiety, persistent feelings of hopelessness and sadness. We're seeing increased suicidal ideation. And, just to sit with that for a second, suicide is the second leading cause of death for children age 15 to 19 years old. So it's after motor vehicle and accidental death. That is a true threat to the lives of children. And, I think we can talk about stats and we kind of can stay up here, but really picturing what that means as a kid and how that's showing up in schools, talking with a lot of our school partners and working in this field myself, it's a few trends we're seeing is it seems to be showing up earlier. And there's a few different reasons, but it's surprising that I'm now having conversations around suicidal ideation with kids as young as 6 to 8 years old. Whereas before that was something we saw more in earlier adolescence. We're also seeing those increased concerns. And I would also say that there is a general shift towards actually this generation having, it's a beautiful shift in this generation of feeling potentially more open about their mental health concerns. So we do actually have seen a slight increase in help seeking. Now, of course, it's very nuanced. That's really based on an individual's culture. But what our schools are saying is there are kids knocking down the door without support.
Well, I'm glad they're looking for help. As you were speaking, I recalled something that came across news briefs, my education news briefs, and that was that there was an 11-year-old in New Jersey last week who committed suicide in a school bathroom. And I just thought, how is that possible that at such a young age, and you just said 6 to 8, where they're having suicidal ideation? I have no words. I'm really stuck on that as I think about, those are first graders that we're talking about and second graders. Before I forget, though, I do want you to make sure that we get a link to that Surgeon General's report. We want to make it as easy as possible for folks to find, and then we'll put that down in the show notes. So that's not getting any better, right? Why are we seeing this trend? I mean, what's going on?
That's a hard question to disentangle. And the reason why that's hard is because our mental health doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? If you even reflect or think about what impacts your own mental health, it's going to be your genetics and biology. It's going to be your relationships with friends and family. It's going to be what's going on in your community. And it's also going to be really influenced by society and cultural norms. And so, there are a few points that we talk frequently about, especially around adolescent mental health. And so a few of those are, one, we're seeing a onset of early puberty is actually impacting mental health. And the simplest way for me to to think about that is basically bodies are developing faster than our brains. And so when that rush of hormones comes, right, it's like, whoa, like you just really want and hope that you have your prefrontal cortex is working great and it can help you manage and you have those coping skills. And if puberty is now shifting towards like 9-10 years old, I mean, that is so much to handle. And our brain hasn't developed to the point where it can help us out in that situation, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that. And I know that every single middle school teacher, parent of a middle school child that's on the line or listens to this is going, oh yeah, their bodies are definitely moving a whole lot faster than their brains were. I know I don't know if this is your area or not, but it reminds me of when I first read an article about brain pruning in adolescence. And I said, well, that explains why they lose their minds, normal behavior, normal development, they lose their minds. And it doesn't come back until sometime around 18, maybe.
Exactly.
But you also said that genetics plays a role. So are there certain mental illnesses or some people disproportionately impacted because of genetics?
Absolutely. So we do see mental illness can be hereditary. So risk is passed down through families. And so that's something really important to think about. And it's also, I could go on and on about this, but it also makes it really complicated within a family, because if you think of the family unit and the culture around mental health, and then for families who have individuals who are really suffering, those conversations, those dynamics, the help seeking that your mom or your dad did when they were growing up, that's going to just really play a huge role culturally in how you view mental health, how you may seek out mental health. And as you mentioned before, especially for individuals who've had poor experiences in the mental health system, and there are many out there, right? And that is in many parts due to the systematic discrimination and that we see across the mental health care system, where it's going to impact your ability to access care.
Yeah. When we don't talk about it, shove it under the rug, pretend that aunt who's just a little eccentric and not mentally ill, it doesn't help our children understand that there is something that is a health issue that they can get help with. And there may be some of an embarrassment factor there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how do especially teens, adolescents, how do they get help? Where do they go?
So I think teens, like all of us, they're looking for a safe and trusted space. And so that's going to look different for individuals. But I would say on general and trend, like looking broadly as trends, teens are going to friends and they're also going to social media. And so we've seen a huge influx of mental health content on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, which is a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think there's been this amazing, I remember watching, there was a big trend around like pointing out symptoms of mental illness. And so I think it normalized for so many individuals, like, oh my gosh, this is not just a me thing. Conversely, on the other side, that information isn't always accurate. It isn't correct. And a lot of times we need to have more nuanced conversations with kids around mental health and what that means. And so I remember having one patient who came in and saw me and she was like, I think I have schizophrenia. I saw it on TikTok. And the core anxiety and concern and how do I tell my parents and what do we do was so incredibly real. And so there's pros and cons to it for sure.
Yeah. There was a show where a young child had looked on social media to find out how to commit suicide. So there are things out there that are incredibly dangerous to our children. And we need to make sure that the resources they use are correct and helpful. So I go back into schools, but I think about how so many of our schools don't have proper support services. Counselors are overloaded. There aren't any social workers at the school. When I think about in all the years that I've worked in school systems and across the US and I think I'm up to 46 states now, pretty much everywhere. I have yet to see a school system that offers comprehensive mental health supports for students, or really any health supports for students. Even though, as I think about that, I know that my work has always been focused in schools that have large numbers of marginalized learners. So, Elsa, I know your bio stated that you have had a focus on underreached populations, and I think we're talking about the same groups of people. So talk to us about the mental health landscape in our public schools. Are kids able to get help? Can they get that support in school?
You've also kind of alluded to this fact that just globally, we are in a provider shortage. It is incredibly hard to find outpatient support and care. It is incredibly hard to find a provider who also takes your insurance. And so studying that as a landscape, we are actually seeing this is kind of a staggering statistic, but 90% of kids who receive treatment receive it in a school-based setting.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And that also includes prevention work as well. But systematically, it has been really pushed onto schools, whether they are prepared or not.
Yeah. With that lack of preparedness, I would imagine, like everything else, that those services are not provided equitably. So are you seeing discrepancies in who gets services, who's providing services, and then what type of services are they getting, or the quality of services provided to children?
Absolutely. So now there are some really interesting initiatives around establishing school-based mental health centers and some federal funding for those supports. And I would say those have been kind of like the gold standard of actually properly staffing, supporting, and being able to provide access to both evidence-based care. But I think when I think about equitable access to care, I don't just think about the evidence-based care. Is this like culturally responsive, trauma-informed care where we have therapists who have worked on reducing their own internal biases, where we have providers who are equipped with the education and tools to really feel empowered to provide support in a way that is destigmatizing and inclusive for a wide variety of kids. And I would say, it is an impossible situation in the majority of schools because counselors are overworked, they're burnt out, and they are not given the proper supports around providing the care that children are actually seeking.
No, go ahead, Jake, please.
I was going to say, schools are in a tough spot. Like they're not really designed to be places of mental health support, but yet they know that students are struggling too much academically and suffering emotionally and with their health. So they have to provide more. So they're in this tough spot. The counselor to student ratio on average is something like 440 students to one counselor. That counselor is, like you said, not necessarily a social worker, right? They are providing like academic, what classes should you take, potentially helping with college applications, and then also trying to counsel students when they're struggling with mental health issues. So it is a tough place for them to be. I think, to Elsa's point earlier, post-COVID, certainly schools and districts and superintendents are taking that role seriously, understand they need to do more, understand if they don't do more, the problems with equity, as you mentioned, are just going to get worse, especially given kids who are suffering even more during the pandemic. So, when we talk to schools and districts, we see a lot of efforts there, but we know, and I think they know, that there's still a large gap.
It made me think about a system I was working with, I think it was last summer, and they were sharing that they had a family of children where they lost both parents and grandparents to the pandemic. So these kids, the amount of trauma that they went through over that really about a year's time, they said that all this happened. And that is a system that has no support services available. They don't have a social worker in the district. So the teachers were trying to figure out, how do they support these kids? And that's not what I was there for, just in talking about equity and some of the challenges that teachers are facing. But you said something that I want to make sure, you said two things I want to make sure that we get a little bit more information on. Elsa, you said first, there's money available. There's some federal funding that districts can tap into.
Yeah, there is. And Jay can also speak to this as well. With the pandemic, we also saw a fair amount of funding around COVID relief efforts. And some of that money can be used to support mental health and student wellness. Jay, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, and recently there were more federal dollars going towards mental health supports for communities and schools that have been allocated. So there are some dollars. It is helpful to be having more in-person care. Is it going to meet the need? No. Your ratio goes from maybe 440 to 420 or 410 or whatnot, but that's still more kids getting support that may otherwise not have happened. And so definitely in the right direction, but still pretty far short of the need.
Yeah, I think about being, when I first started teaching, I was in the high school. I only had to remember 150 kids' names. I can't imagine being a counselor and having to remember 400 plus, or to be able to respond in any effective way to the challenges that many children are facing.
Yeah, and typically what they end up seeing is about 10 to 20% of their caseload is who they end up getting to know and seeing. So, you develop relationships with about 50 to 60, but then that other 350 plus don't really build a relationship with, they're not as comfortable with. And so it's hard to really know what's happening with them and how to help them.
Awesome. Yeah. And those are the ones that are beating down your door, right? They're not the ones that are withdrawn or maybe having some challenges and don't know where to go.
Exactly.
One other thing I picked up on, and I probably don't have it right, but you said something about culturally responsive care. Mm-hmm. Tell me what that is.
Absolutely. So when I think about culturally responsive care, there's a few different elements. One, we know that a core part of providing any sort of care or service is establishing a trusting relationship. And so when I'm really thinking about, if I'm building a picture of a culturally responsive provider, it's someone who leads with humility, with curiosity, who recognizes their own biases and stereotypes, and therefore is able to identify the children at risk, no matter how their inward struggles are presenting outwardly. Another core element is the segment of education. And so there are strategies around how do you talk to a kid who's experienced trauma? How do you provide inclusive and welcoming care to LGBTQIA youth by not accidentally doing a microaggression and using the wrong pronoun or not knowing the right term? How do you connect and talk to someone whose lived experience may be so radically different? And then the third part I really like to focus in on is really a focus on individual strengths. And so I think a lot of times when we're talking about underreached at-risk populations, we kind of like stereotype that you look a certain way, you're going to act a certain way, and in some ways there's no hope for you. And kind of as I mentioned before, taking this more approach of really looking at strengths and seeing how kids have been incredibly adaptive when they've grown up in really difficult circumstances.
So really, that's no different. We think about culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, which is my lane. We're talking about the same thing. So those educators who have had some foundational work in culturally responsive teaching should be able to automatically connect to how do we care for children who might be struggling with some mental health issues or trauma. It's through that same lens, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's even accepting, behavior that you might think is different, but is culturally normal. Right. So we, in our process of even building alongside, we talk to a lot of school-based social workers and counselors. And, the reality is we have a majority white female teaching force across the entire country, no matter where you're from.
About 86% of all teachers. Yeah.
Yep. And same with counselors, and frankly, same with therapists as well. And so there are these norms and biases that folks have. And so we talked to an African-American social worker where she says, I often get sent African-American boys that really should not be getting sent to me, but I'm sent them because they're doing things differently than what the teacher expects. And instead of it being something that could be maybe handled in the classroom, it becomes like a disruptive thing that has to get sent to me where I don't really see the problem. And no one has even asked the student, like, how are they doing or what's going on? And there is just quick judgment and, okay, go see the counselor and get out of my classroom, for an example. So to go back to that cultural responsiveness. So if we are showing that and teaching that in the classroom, even for learning, then yes, some of that should apply to behavior as well. That then allows these differences to be handled in a classroom versus then requiring the work of somebody else.
So let's say I'm a principal, a school leader, school board member, school support services counselor, whatever that role is, who's listening to this today. What is it that they can do to help their school systems address this mental illness crisis, mental health crisis, and to be more equitable and improve the services that they offer to children?
And I hate to say that it comes down to this core issue of burnout and just not enough providers. But I think at the crux of the issue is when you are that under-resourced, it is incredibly hard. And so be really thoughtful in thinking about how do I make my dollar go far and give support that I need. I think one thing I would say that, and I'm curious if you've seen the same pattern happen when I have seen in different mental health settings, this move towards wanting to provide support around DEI education or training in culturally responsive care. One pitfall that I have seen that I like to highlight is that you can't just go to the one Black female therapist and be like, hey, can you go train everyone on this? Oh, we're not going to pay you and we're not going to, sorry, I'm a little sassy. We're not going to pay you and we're not going to give you recognition. It has to come from that is an incredibly valued position and bringing incredible value to the work that your providers or counselors are going to do. And thus find experts, or if you have an expert on your team, reward and properly, compensate for that expertise.
Yeah, I call it the bullshit of performative equity, sort of lines up with that. But we have a Black counselor, so we send all our Black kids to them. No, that is not the solution to your inequity in your system. So I do run into exactly the same thing all the time. And the other side of that is white people expecting the people of color to have all the answers and to pick up that extra load. No, we all have to learn how to do this if we're going to be a community of educators that support children. Yeah, I guess it's, would that be endemic, systemic? It's a lot.
Yeah, I would say maybe from a broader lens, kind of 4 things I would do as a district leader. One is to think about culture, as we just talked about, but specifically even just, schools are often a system of accountability, right? We have grades and whatnot, punishments, detention, but we know students need support. And so how does that support show up? When we interview students, the number that just get asked, like, how are you doing today, is a pretty small percent, surprisingly. In an environment where you're with adults and other peers for 8 hours a day, if not more. And so I think there's a lot to do about thinking about culture and leading a cultural change. There's the point about with mental health destigmatizing, as you mentioned, for all communities. And within your community, we see schools that will even have mental health clubs for students that they can join and run, and then maybe have a way for them to share with educators or with administrators what they think they need, for example. So just that process of being, hey, it's okay to talk about this. It's okay to have groups about this, share information on this. Then, as Elsa mentioned, getting people and training them, to the extent that there are more counselors, or we can find ways to get budget for that, or even hire social workers and that are culturally responsive and trained in that. And then lastly, we think a lot about prevention. That's partially where we're coming at it from is, okay, we have a broad base of students. Can we do things that help with prevention so that less students reach these feelings of hopelessness or even worse?
Yeah. An ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Or cheaper to maintain than to fix it when it's broken. I'm thinking about, my face right now. But I'm sure people are wondering, Jay, how or why does a tech guy create a mental health startup? So please tell us the alongside story.
Yeah. So we started the company about a year ago. And prior to that, we had been working with schools, my co-founders and myself, for the past 10 years, actually building a technology curriculum solution for grades 6 through 12 primarily. And in that process, our main goal was really to set high expectations for everyone. So we knew that whenever kids have high expectations from teachers and in their work, they perform better. It didn't matter what zip code you're from. And so that was really the purpose of our product then. And as that product, it grew and evolved, and we started talking to schools and districts about, hey, where else could we help? And this problem of mental health kept coming up. And as Elsa mentioned, it was back at the beginning of last calendar year where the Surgeon General warning came out, American Association of Pediatrics as well. And so as we were researching this, we ended up talking to a lot of schools, a lot of counselors and social workers at schools, as well as we ended up interviewing 70, 80 adolescents and teens about what their struggles are, what could be helpful for them. And essentially these consistent themes emerged where we knew kids needed help. They didn't really have a safe space to go. And schools were struggling and were a provider of services that needed more support. So given our background working with schools and also working with teens, we thought, okay, maybe technology can be helpful here, and we can build something that is a broad-based solution so we can provide something at very, very low cost, make it accessible, make it equitable. That's what we were about at our last company. And we thought, okay, we can do it again, but for mental health.
Kudos to you for recognizing that there was an unmet need and then doing something about it. I mean, really doing something about it. So how does Alongside help schools support students?
Yeah, so what we try to do is focus on what we call, what schools will call tier one. So the idea of tier one is, hey, this is something that can be provided to all students, whereas tier two becomes more specialized support for a few. And then tier three is, when students are really struggling, and usually that doesn't happen in the building, and that's going to be supported by other third parties. And so our idea was to have an app that really helps students feel validated, build resilience, and help them develop better relationships, and also really address the issues that they're struggling with. So when we talk to teens, there's things like social emotional learning or other ways of getting help, but those don't address what students are struggling with in the moment. And so what we wanted to do was help students with what they're dealing with in the moment. So what the app does is it has a chatbot that students can use, where they help get validation, as well as get strategies to help them with whatever issue they're dealing with. Could be a friendship issue, could be a relationship, could be school and schoolwork. And we use practices developed by Elsa and her team to make sure that those are grounded in what you would do almost if you were talking to a therapist. It's not at that level, but close. And beyond that, we allow students to do a lot of different activities like calming activities, breathing, journaling, learning. So they have access to a bunch of other tools that can help them in the moment.
Okay. You're going to help us out here. You said chatbot. And I think I told you, we have listeners who are parents, educators, politicians, K-12 content providers, the whole gamut in the K-12 space. I kind of get the chatbot thing, but for those listeners who might not, who might be skeptical, who distrust technology, please explain it to us so somebody like my mom who can't reset the password on her laptop would understand. So what's a chatbot?
Yeah, so I think the best way to start is thinking about probably your experience with like a customer service chatbot, where you might have clicked on, I'm on some website, I click on the support button, and then I start typing and I get a response back. Mostly those are very disappointing experiences where you're not feeling heard. You're saying, how can I reset my password? You don't get an answer. And before you know it, 15 minutes later, you have to call someone anyway. But, that idea of, okay, I chat and then there is some type of computer responding to me, that is ultimately what a chatbot is. Okay. Now, that technology has improved dramatically. And not every website is implementing the latest and greatest, but what you can do is actually understand what a user is saying much better than you used to be able to. And then for us specifically, we can take them down a certain path based on what they're talking about. So it gets to be interactive. Nowadays, especially with our chatbot, we can make the user actually feel heard instead of you're just typing away and you just keep getting these canned responses that don't make you feel heard. And then again, we can present strategies that help them. So it is a back and forth text message that, in an ideal world almost feels like you're chatting with a human being, but it is a bot.
Okay. Yeah. And our kids know how to chat.
Yes, they definitely know. And when we interviewed them, a lot of kids feel safe in that, in the same way that we as, adults feel uncomfortable with that, or who's listening on their side or who is on their side. For kids, there's a lot of safety in not having to tell someone right away and being able to still express themselves.
Yeah. We always had that best friend or dog or cat or something that we could tell all our secrets to. But I think our kids have moved into, or our kids, for me, it's my grandkids or grandchild's generation that is there, and technology is more their friend. Elsa, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was going to say, I think an interesting point here is kind of as Jay was alluding to, kids feel way more comfortable, like just texting back and forth with a bot than probably most adults do. And another interesting point is we also see increased utilization and comfort of reaching out for support in communities who have high stigma around mental health. And so globally, we actually see more usage of chatbots for mental health than we do in higher income countries where there's less stigma.
So I love technology. I firmly believe in technology as long as it works. But I do worry about the amount of time kids spend on their devices. I said I have a 15-year-old grandson. I swear he goes through physical withdrawals if he's separated from his tech for more than 15 minutes. Of course, I tell my daughter to keep him in line, just take all of the power cords to all his devices if you want to punish him. That'll keep him straight. So I wonder, is technology the solution for our kids because they are on devices so much?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I think we started with as well. Is the solution obviously similar to you? Can we have a general sense that technology can be helpful, but in this instance, will it? And one of the things that surprised us during our interview process before we formed the company was how many clinical providers and others actually were supportive of technology coming in and helping. Whereas I thought most people would be like, hey, you don't have a clinical background, how are you going to help? But people knew that there needed to be accessible solutions, which technology can provide. And, for us, we are not trying to, maximize student attention and time on alongside. We're just trying to provide them with tools and skills to help in the moment. So about 45% of our chats actually have to deal with relationship issues, whether that's friendships, family, other loved ones, peers, loneliness issues. So Elsa can maybe get more into this, but a lot of our strategies are actually focused on having students develop better relationships. So we view ourselves as the alternative to social media to actually get help and to spend time in real life, and encouraging students and giving them strategy on how to do that. That's where we see it versus like, okay, now I'm going to spend 2 hours on alongside. And frankly, we don't see that from our usage patterns. Like students don't spend that much time. They get the help they need, or they do an activity and then they move on.
Awesome. Elsa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that, clinically, our perspective is our goal is to basically take 2 to 3 minutes to help a kid identify one small thing they can either do to cope or work on the problem or challenge or situation that they are dealing with. And that's going to increase empowerment. That's going to boost your mood. That's going to increase levels of hope, which we know is an early predictor of positive mental health long-term. And so it really just is. It's like, let's have kind of a quick coaching conversation. And then, if you had that fight with a friend, now your job is to go talk to your friend. And I'm going to give you the encouragement and the motivation to do it, but then go live your life. And it's okay if you don't come back to me. Like, use that same technique you learned again the next time you're in a fight as well with your friend.
So I have a bad morning coming to school, fight with my friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is. And so I text on my way to class. And by the time I get, 5 minutes later, I've got something to help me get through the rest of that day, or at least the period. So sort of laser-like and in the moment is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. And we try as much as possible to get down to the very specific thing that a kiddo is struggling with. So it actually feels like we've heard you and we're giving you really targeted advice that makes sense, not just the general, let's just take some deep breaths, and which is very effective, But I think I say that with some sass because most kids I work with will just roll their eyes and be like, no, just help me with this convo,
I worked really hard at not rolling my eyes when you said that. I do the breathing thing. Marginalized populations, though, it does seem like everybody's got a smartphone, but I still think, what about the kids who don't? Can they still use alongside? Can they still get some help that way?
Yeah, so we're working with school districts now that have a large free and reduced lunch population, various backgrounds, and typically they're at least providing laptops so you can use alongside even on a laptop. So it doesn't have to be your personal phone or device. And we go as low as sixth grade where, by sixth grade, I think across the country, 25 to 30% may have a smartphone. By eighth grade, that's closer to 75, 80. But we know kids, especially in the middle school ages, don't necessarily have one. So we do allow access via computer or iPads or whatnot, whatever the school might be providing.
Okay. So especially where, more and more districts have a one-to-one initiative and they're giving Chromebooks or whatever it is for kids to have tech to access the content that's provided only digitally in their schools. So they've still got a route in, even if they don't have a phone.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Awesome. Okay. Still thinking about kids, and they say some really weird stuff sometime. So how does your chatbot know what's real, and what can it do or what does it do if a child is really in crisis? Because there's not necessarily that it's a chatbot. It's not another real person on the other end. What happens then?
So we use a machine learning algorithm that's based in, I'm going to use a fancy word, natural language processing. And all that I just say is to basically that we are being able to read and monitor for specific words that are concerning to us. Anything around suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, abuse, and the like. And so, of course, students occasionally may also write in around really serious stuff and not mean it. But we really work with schools when we're doing our onboarding process to help students know what we're monitoring, what we're looking at, what we're not looking at. And so if we do detect that a child is at risk of harm or being abused or harming someone else, we try to gather a tiny bit more information from them about what's going on. We direct them to the best 24/7 resources, especially after hours. So this is 988, or many counties or districts also have amazing local resources that we partner with schools on what exactly we want to show to students. And, I do think too, in the process of this, it does feel better. I'm sure you've maybe seen it, like there's always that disclaimer of like, call 988 if you're at risk.
Yeah.
And what we're also trying to do within the chat, if a kid is talking about that, we try to destigmatize calling 988 and reaching out to help, giving them information about what's going to happen when they call, addressing fears that 988 is just going to call 911 and I'm going to be hospitalized, which is a huge fear. And as sometimes is the absolute correct step to take. And many times it increases stigma. And so we also pass along that information to our school counselors and school partners. And so for us too, it's really, really important. The human element is so critical. And so being able to help students be guided as an on-ramp into in-person care or support where there's someone they can talk to is really at the heart of our mission as well.
Awesome. So I've heard you say a couple of times you work with the school system, because I'm thinking, kids not just afraid of being hospitalized, calling 911 sometimes for kids of color means being arrested at school. And we are avoiding that because of the relationship that you develop with the school systems.
Yes, That is our ultimate goal, right? We want to connect you. And we've talked to a lot of kids who have actually said, I'm okay if you call my school counselor. That can be a pretty trusted person, way better than 911. And, having had worked with individuals who have been arrested during a mental health crisis in Atlanta, that is my fear, because it is dangerous for individuals.
We see enough of that in the news. So I'm glad to hear that that's going on.
No, I was just going to add that this is one of the reasons why we decided to work with both with schools instead of just going directly working with adolescents, is because you actually have that live care component. that can be helpful. Otherwise, it can be challenging to provide that, or it costs a lot of money. So to be able to direct and funnel students to those resources, especially when they're most needed, is something that's important for us in terms of providing the care we need to students, but then also important to schools, so they can be identifying and helping out where the need is greatest.
Awesome. I'm loving this conversation. I have one last question, same question to the both of you. At the end of my podcast, I always sign off paraphrasing Dr. Angela Davis. She said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. So same question to each of you. What is the thing you cannot accept? And what can my listeners do to support that change in their own communities? Jay, you're first.
Okay, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. I would go back to why we started Alongside for me. I just can't accept kids suffering, especially with their mental health, without having any option to get better. And so, again, we talked with so many adolescents as we started this, and it was so surprising to see how both brave and aware they were of their situation and still couldn't do anything about it. And it just felt sad. We talked to students. I talked to kids who, you could hear farm animals in the background in Texas or in the inner city of Philadelphia, and just all over the country. It was everywhere. And so that's something I think I could not accept. I think I've always, I know as adults, sometimes there's things that happen in your past that make your situation what it is. But with kids, I just really always feel it. You're not yet responsible for your situation at 11, 12, 13. And what folks can do, a little bit, I think, comes back to what you started with about destigmatizing mental health. So that's one. It's not something that we should take lightly. It's something that we can take seriously. It is an organ in the body, as Elsa mentioned. So that's certainly one. The second one is just, when you are walking by or you see an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old, even 14-year-old, even 17-year-old, just asking them, how are you doing? What's going on? And it can just be, I'm not even a stranger sometimes, right? Just a 5-minute conversation, someone who's curious and who cares and wants to learn a little bit more, that can brighten up any kid's day. We see that right now in our product, where kids just having somebody to chat with feels good to them. So that means it's not happening enough in real life. And that is something that anybody, all of us can do.
Yeah, it's like the saying, if you see someone without a smile, give them one of yours.
Yeah.
So just smiling and saying hello, even if you don't have a conversation, may be the one human contact a person has in their day that makes a big difference.
Exactly.
Dr. Friis.
Okay. Oh, so I think the one thing is this idea that if we don't see it, it doesn't exist. And when I think about that for mental health, it's like, we have to be okay seeing that people are not okay. You have to ask, you have to look, and it can be incredibly scary. And it is much easier to just go along in your life with this, I don't ask, I don't see, I don't tell, we can deal with the status quo. And so, I especially feel this very, very deeply around the concept and a myth that's out there around, if you ask about suicide, it's going to increase the risk of someone thinking about suicide or attempting suicide. And that's just a blatantly false myth. So to play a little bit off of Jay, I think my call to action is just ask family member, loved one, the kid you're seeing looking down, or the kid who is acting out, and joking around all the time. You never know what's going on, and it can be scary to find what you see, but once you start to do it, you'll actually notice, even if you're not a mental health professional, as a human, we have incredible power to support each other.
Awesome. Well, for those of you who are interested in learning more about Alongside, today we're going to do more than just give you a link in the show notes. If you're interested in how Alongside can help students in your school, your district, click the link that is in the show notes, mention podcast for a special offer for Jay. Thank you for joining me in a special episode featuring everyday equity warriors doing amazing things. Now, make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. And before you leave, hit that like button, subscribe, share. Now, if you're listening on an audio podcast, you can check the show notes for the link to YouTube. Turn on notifications so you always know when the next episode has posted. And of course, spread the word. My guests today have been Jay Goyal and Dr. Elsa Friis, with alongside Jay, Dr. Friis. Thank you for joining me and sharing your mission and your wisdom. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who listened today has a new view, hopefully an enlightened view, and a better understanding about mental health and how technology can support the mental health of our children. To you equity warriors out there, if you or someone you know is an everyday equity warrior doing amazing things like the people on screen here, let me know. We have more awesome and inspiring guests coming up, and maybe you or someone you know should be one of them. Now, like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, and as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Let's change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.